When the message came through, no one on Earth believed it was real, not at first. Across the globe, it crackled through every satellite transmission, every screen, every device connected to the net. There were no warnings, no context, just a chilling, smug voice layered over the haunting image of a once thriving colony burning in silence. People of Earth and her colonies. The speaker wasn't human. It looked almost reptilian, its body covered in dark metallic scales, its elongated skull crowned by strange sensory ridges that pulsed with color. The creature wore something like a ceremonial robe, and behind it, others of its kind paced a vast, sterile bridge filled with alien technology. The camera panned slightly to show what was left of New Eden, once humanity's most ambitious colony, reduced to ash. 12 million lives, wiped out in a single rotation. You see before you the remains of New Eden, your proudest achievement. 12 million of your kind extinguished in less than one planetary cycle. Witness the price of defiance. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't even a declaration of war. It was a smug, calculated broadcast of domination. A lesson, as they called it, from a species that thought itself superior. At first, there was shock. News anchors fumbled with their words. Military officials refused to comment. Social media exploded with disbelief, conspiracy theories, and denial. But then the satellite footage started rolling in the firestorms, the cratered Earth, the orbital wreckage still smoldering in the void. Messages from survivors, few and scattered, confirmed the worst. New Eden had fallen, not by accident, not by natural disaster. It had been annihilated, exterminated on purpose. The Concordat had come, and they had chosen violence. Across the nations of Earth, panic began to rise. Emergency councils convened behind closed doors. Defense networks scrambled into high alert, but it was too late for caution, too late for diplomacy. This wasn't the beginning. It was the aftermath of a massacre, and the perpetrators had already taken a victory lap. The alien's voice, haughty and clinical, echoed across every medium. The galactic Concordat has brought peace to 17,000 species. You are not exceptional. You will surrender your sovereignty within 20 rotations or share New Eden's fate. Perhaps Mars next, or Earth itself. The words themselves might have been terrifying if it hadn't been for the way they were delivered with such dismissive confidence, such obvious belief that humanity would fold. That we were nothing but another primitive race that needed to be shown its place in the cosmos. The bridge behind the speaker roared with what must have been alien laughter. Bioluminescent patches glowed and flickered in strange, celebratory rhythms. Some drank odd substances. Others danced, clicking mandibles in what looked like a victory ritual. They truly believed they had won. They believed that this broadcast would break us. Instead, it awakened something far, far worse. It began slowly, too slowly for the aliens to notice. They didn't see it at first, or maybe they mistook it for chaos, but humans began to change. In a world normally fragmented by politics, borders, and ideology, the devastation of New Eden became a unifying cry. Rival leaders issued joint statements. Enemies set aside generations of conflict. Civilian volunteers flooded recruitment offices. Tech firms turned their R&D into weapons labs overnight. Even the corporations, those behemoths of greed and secrecy, suddenly opened their vaults. Humanity had always been fractured, always fighting itself in some form. It was part of who we were. But this broadcast, it struck a nerve deeper than any war or famine or ideology ever had. It wasn't just about New Eden. It was about being underestimated. Throughout history, every time humanity had been told it couldn't survive plague, war, climate, collapse, it clawed its way back with fire in its eyes. And now, someone had dared to wipe 12 million souls off the map and call it a lesson. You don't teach a species like ours by killing its people. You incite it. In Washington, Beijing, Moscow, London, and dozens of other capitals, black-suited advisors leaned over war room tables, barking commands and signing emergency orders. But in truth, the response didn't come from governments. It came from everywhere at once. A naval engineer in Singapore repurposed outdated submarine schematics into vacuum-sealed drone carriers. A disgraced AA programmer in Berlin wrote an adaptive combat protocol that rewrote itself every 5 seconds. A crew of mechanics in New Mexico welded together a makeshift railgun using salvaged mining gear and raw spite. Farmers offered fuel depots. Miners offered ore, Coders rewrote military software for fun. Hackers breached alien data relays within 36 hours of the broadcast going live. Mars went dark for a full day. When it came back online, its surface was crawling with defense satellites and retooled haulers turned missile carriers. The Moon, already halfway converted into a refit hub. The Concordat had thought the humans would plead. They hadn't counted on our rage. They hadn't counted on our grief. And most of all, they hadn't counted on our ability to adapt on the fly. We didn't wait to be told what to do. We did what we always did. We learned fast, failed faster, and fought harder than anyone thought possible. In a hidden orbital facility, once used for deep space observation, now transformed into a tactical headquarters, War Chief Zara Knight stood before a bank of consoles as live feeds flooded in. She was a career soldier once labeled too aggressive by peacekeeping committees. Now, she was the face of Earth's vengeance. "They think we're broken?" she said coldly. Her dark eyes locked on a real-time satellite image of the enemy fleet. "They think we'll beg, but they just gave us something we've never had before." Her aide leaned in, confused. "What's that, ma'am?" "A common enemy." When the Unified Response broadcast was launched, the entire planet fell silent to hear it. It was brief. It didn't need to be long. "Your 20 rotations are declined." Zara's voice carried no anger, only ice. There was no threat, no warning, just a simple truth. Humanity does not negotiate with genocidal cowards. The message repeated in every language automatically translated, instantly understood. It aired on every screen, every device, every relay. Even Concordat listening stations picked it up before scrambling to block it. Too late. They had issued their challenge in arrogance. And in that moment, they realized deep in their cold, calculating hearts that they had awakened something ancient and terrible. Some species evolve through harmony, others through order. But humanity, we evolve through pressure. That's the part they never understood. Our history is a long, bloody list of disasters, wars, collapses, and reinventions. Every age of peace only came after a struggle for survival. We learned by being broken. We grew by clawing our way out of the dirt. The Concordat hadn't dealt us a fatal blow. They had given us the greatest gift imaginable, unity born from loss. And with that unity came innovation, drive, vengeance. They saw the fires of New Eden and thought it would break our spirit. What they didn't understand was that fire doesn't destroy us, it forges us. Within the first 24 hours, every major orbital platform switched from civilian to military operations. Entire cities volunteered for blackout drills. Tech labs opened their doors to military oversight. Underground bunkers activated protocols written during the Cold War and thought obsolete. The timeline for weapons testing was reduced from months to days. A new fleet was being built not tomorrow, not next year now. But most terrifying of all was what they didn't see: the improvisation. The humans weren't just activating old weapons, they were inventing new ones. New strategies, new systems. In back rooms and basements, in labs and garages, they worked tirelessly with one question in mind: how do we make sure this never happens again? On the Concordat command vessel, the alien officers laughed and danced in their victory. They didn't know. They didn't see what was coming. They had mistaken silence for surrender. But across the stars, far from their gleaming command bridge, humanity had already started rewriting the rules of war. And the first lesson: never provoke a species that has nothing left to lose. The world was still reeling in the hours following the broadcast. You could feel it everywhere, an undercurrent of rage, pain, and something else simmering just beneath the surface. Silence had followed the Concordat's message, but it wasn't fear. It was focus. The immediate human reaction wasn't a formal declaration of war. It wasn't fury spilled out in street riots or mass panic. No, it was more dangerous than that. It was quiet meetings in shadowed rooms, whispers passed in high-security bunkers, and sleepless engineers hunched over desks beneath flickering lights. Across every continent, in every major population center, humanity was thinking, planning, changing. For the first time in human history, there were no sides. There was no West and East, no NATO, no UN Security Council, no ideological divides. There was only us, and there was them. It began with simple coordination. Within 12 hours, the world's major militaries had synchronized communication systems. Firewalls were dropped between national defense networks that had been siloed for decades. The first meeting of the Global Emergency Coalition initially laughed off as a PR stunt morphed into the largest digital summit in history. The feed was broadcast from a secure orbital uplink once meant for deep space telescopic analysis. It now served as the unified command center for Earth's planetary defense. Inside, rows of military advisors, scientists, civilian leaders, and representatives of Mars and the lunar colonies shared the same table. Commander Angela Park, a career military strategist with dual citizenship in both the United States and South Korea, stood before a wall of screens showing global defense statuses. She didn't mince words. We are no longer separate nations. We are no longer competing superpowers. We are no longer fragmented interests. We are one species. And the clock is ticking. Her words were played in over 180 languages. The broadcast wasn't flashy or overproduced. It didn't need to be. Everyone watching knew the truth. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about revenge and justice. At the JPL complex in Pasadena, a team of scientists paused their work on the Mars Hydrohabitat project to reassign the site's construction drones for use as orbital repair bots. In Munich, a consortium of physicists repurposed a half-finished particle accelerator into a makeshift mass driver prototype. In Johannesburg, a group of programmers modified satellite weather mapping algorithms into targeting systems accurate enough to pinpoint Concordat ships from the far side of the moon. And in Moscow, a retired cyber warfare expert named Alexei Petrova was quietly brought out of retirement. His job crack: open the Concordat's encrypted transmission and find any tactical value hidden within. He had it decrypted in under 6 hours. What the Concordat hadn't realized was that, in their arrogance, they had given away more than threat. They had given away data energy signatures, ship formations, communication pulses, all embedded in the broadcast they arrogantly thought was just a taunt. That was their mistake. They thought they were speaking to children. They didn't realize they were handing blueprints to builders. Unity didn't come through orders. It came through necessity, through grief. On a quiet hill in Vermont, a small group of colonists stood around a simple stone memorial, a hastily constructed tribute to family members lost on New Eden. Candles flickered in the cold wind as a boy no older than 16 lit a photo of his sister, whispering a promise to the stars. "I'll make them pay, you wasn't alone." From slums in Mumbai to suburbs in Detroit, from the Arctic research bases to the jungles of the Amazon, the same emotion spread like wildfire. Grief hardened into resolve. And it wasn't just the governments that moved. It was the people. A mechanic in Nigeria began converting farm trucks into mobile weapons platforms. An artist in Chile turned anti-Concordat propaganda into recruitment posters. A teacher in Tokyo organized online lessons in orbital mechanics for students wanting to contribute to the war effort. A billionaire tech mogul in Silicon Valley opened his private launch facilities to Earth Space Command. "No one's rich if the species goes extinct," he told the press. "So here, take it all. Use it." Within a day, every known human spaceport had been repurposed into some form of military output. Mars Base Theta, long thought to be under-equipped, suddenly had 3 new orbital defense rings in place. Humanity wasn't preparing for a war in 5 years. It was preparing for a war tomorrow. One of the earliest signs that something fundamental had shifted came from Luna. The moon had always been more symbolic than strategic, a marker of progress, a destination of the past. But in the days following the Concordat broadcast, it became the centerpiece of Earth's planetary defenses. Construction drones, mining bots, and even life support recyclers were reprogrammed into autonomous factories. Lunar regolith was fused into crude but effective armor plating. Solar panels were rerouted to charge railgun capacitors. The first test shot cratered a target over 700 kilometers away. General Tetsuya Kuroda, commander of the moon's security installations, simply said, "That'll do." Mars, too, refused to be a bystander. Normally limited in scope and sparsely populated, the colonies transformed nearly overnight. Vast tunnels, once used for geothermal testing, became bunkers and launch silos. Civilian cargo ships were fitted with forward-facing kinetic rail arrays. The Martian fleet, a term that had once been a joke among Earth's naval elite, was no longer something to laugh at. Within 72 hours, Mars had launched a prototype drone fleet capable of interplanetary travel. They called it Project Leviathan. Meanwhile, something more incredible was happening back on Earth. Cooperation. Old rivalries were shelved, ideologies paused, political differences put on mute. In Paris, a Russian general, a Chinese AI architect, and an American systems engineer met in an underground research facility and began drafting the foundations for a new military architecture, one that could unite human firepower under a single adaptive system. They called it Ares, Autonomous Responsive Engagement System. Ares didn't care about flags or borders. It only cared about the threat. Backed by quantum computing power and built to evolve its tactics in real time, Ares was humanity's way of leveling the playing field. Wouldn't just give orders, it would learn from the enemy. It would adapt. The Concordat had no idea what kind of mind they had sparked into existence. All over the planet, signs of awakening rippled like aftershocks. The International Space Elevator in Kenya, once years from completion, suddenly had 24-hour crews working triple shifts to bring it online. The failed Oceanic Power Plant in Indonesia was converted into a hidden submarine drone port. Greenland's under-ice tunnels built in secret decades ago were reactivated for deep space missile housing. And everywhere, people stopped asking if they could help. They asked how fast. Even Earth's criminal underground got involved. Syndicates that once trafficked in digital crime and black market weapons now smuggled engineers, fabricators, and sensitive materials to conflict zones. The Concordat had committed the one crime that united humanity from warlords to peacekeepers. They had made it personal. Back at Earth HQ, in a chamber deep beneath the Himalayas, Commander Zara Knight reviewed reports from over 700 outposts. Her desk was cluttered with digital readouts, resource allocations, and mission proposals. Status of Saturn's rings? She asked without looking up. Defensive stations Alpha through Gamma complete. Delta on schedule. Titan has offered to house long-range communications backups. Good. Make sure Titan's colony has extra food supplies. I don't want anyone starving while building our future. Across the room, a junior officer held up a new tablet. Ma'am, updated projections suggest we'll double our fleet size in half the time we originally expected. Civilian volunteers are flooding our recruitment centers. We've had to start turning people away. Zara looked up, a tired smile playing on her lips. Don't. We'll need every hand we can get. Of course, not everything went smoothly. Not every government agreed to open its doors. Not every person accepted the call. But the pressure was overwhelming. The need was undeniable. In time, even the hesitant came to see the truth. This wasn't just about humanity surviving. It was about becoming something more. And in that pressure cooker of fear, fury, and unity, a new humanity was forged. The Concordat and their ivory towers orbiting distant stars were still celebrating. They toasted to what they thought was an unanswerable blow. They chuckled over footage of New Eden in flames. They sent private messages to their mates about how easily humans folded, but they didn't understand what silence meant to a human. It meant we were working. It meant we were changing. They had looked at Earth and seen chaos, but what they missed, what they couldn't see, was that we were aligning. Like gears in a machine. Like cells in a growing organism. Like a storm brewing on the horizon. In less than 10 rotations, half the deadline given by the Concordat Earth had transformed. The world was no longer divided. It was no longer distracted by internal conflict or historical baggage. The flags still flew, but they flew side by side. Humanity had become what the Concordat feared most, a single, focused, intelligent force. Not united by conquest or ideology, united by loss. On the 11th day, we sent a new broadcast. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. It showed orbital factories in action, fleets being refit, engineers running diagnostics, soldiers training with prototypes. And then it showed the face of a Martian colonist, an old woman in a worn-out uniform who had lost her granddaughter on New Eden. She looked straight into the camera and said simply, "We're ready when you are." The signal cut, and across the stars, the Concordat, so sure of its superiority, finally began to feel something alien to them. Doubt. The first strike, they thought we'd fight like everyone else. That was their first mistake. The Concordat, for all their technological prowess and cultural refinement, couldn't imagine a species like us, one that didn't fight according to rules or ancient doctrines, one that didn't rely on tradition or consensus or slow, calculated escalation. They expected us to counter with mirrored formations, predictable firepower, and a sense of restraint. What they got instead was chaos with a purpose. Within days of the New Eden broadcast, humanity had already begun weaponizing its greatest evolutionary trait, adaptability. We had no centralized doctrine, no shared military culture, No fixed strategy passed down across millennia like the Concordat's member species. We didn't need it. That rigidity was their strength, but it was also their prison. Ours was a species that learned by falling, by breaking, by losing and crawling back up with blood on our hands and new ideas in our heads. And now, with a single, horrific act, the Concordat had forced the entirety of humanity to learn together fast. And we did. It started small, not on the front lines, not in boardrooms, but in hangars, workshops, and half-abandoned labs. A civilian engineer in Brazil took one look at the Concordat's ship structure from a captured fragment and muttered, "We could copy that drive frame and retrofit it with carbon-fused ceramic. Might hold twice the thrust." He didn't wait for orders. He started building. On a Martian mining station, a group of geologists hacked the software of their seismic probes and turned them into precision-targeted tremor mines, capable of disabling Concordat landing crafts before they even touched soil. A pair of teenage drone racers in Kansas reverse-engineered parts from a scavenged AI navigation module, merging it with their homemade quadcopters. The result: autonomous recon scouts that could fly through Concordat shielding nets undetected, broadcasting live telemetry. No one told them to do it, they just did. That was the terrifying part for the Concordat, at least. We weren't improvising because we were desperate, we were improvising because we could. And every hour that passed, more ideas poured in, more minds lit up. Mules were broken in pursuit of what worked. The Concordat noticed eventually. They had to. Within the first week of humanity's counter-response, their outer system patrols started reporting anomalies. Ships behaving unpredictably. Civilian freighters equipped with unfamiliar energy arrays, orbital platforms that had previously scanned as inactive suddenly lighting up with non-standard emissions. They chalked it up to noise civilizations flailing in the dark. Panic, confusion, a primitive race lashing out before the inevitable surrender. They weren't wrong that it was chaotic, but they were dead wrong about the purpose behind it. Back on Earth, the Global Emergency Coalition wasn't trying to manage the chaos, they were feeding it. The new mantra among the Joint Commanders and scientific liaisons was simple: let them build. Let them try. Just keep the data flowing. Every skirmish became a test bed. Every retreat was a reconnaissance run. Every minor loss yielded pages of insight. Human commanders began sending back live field data to central systems, which ran continuous updates to frontline AIs. Within minutes, countermeasures were implemented. It wasn't a war. It was a lab experiment with live ammunition. At Site Theta, a hidden base in Antarctica repurposed from a long-abandoned climate research station, a group of interdisciplinary scientists led by Dr. Eliza Endur began cataloging every Concordat weapon signature encountered across the system. Her team's job wasn't to study the enemy tech, they were to remix it. Within days, they discovered that a Concordat energy disruption rifle, ineffective in Earth's thick atmosphere, could be modified to piggyback on localized magnetic fields. The result: a new class of rail stunners that required no line of sight and could disable Concordat drones through walls. Eliza's reaction when they first fired one: "We shouldn't be able to do that, but we just did." That line became a running joke among Earth scientists. If it shouldn't work, we made it work anyway. Meanwhile, in orbit, Commander Zara Knight reviewed live drone footage from a strike team operating out of Ganymede. "Ma'am," her tactical officer reported, "they used a gravity well generator meant for terraforming and turned it into a directional launch accelerator. Slung 3 stealth bombers toward the enemy shipyard before the Concordat sensors even registered a change in mass." Zara raised an eyebrow. "We have stealth bombers." "Not officially," the officer replied. She smirked. That was another thing that Concordat didn't understand. Most of our weapons weren't built in labs. They were born in sheds, in garages, in dirt. One of the most dramatic turning points came on day 13. The Concordat launched a coordinated push toward Earth's orbit from 3 vectors. Each was met with resistance, but not in the way they expected. One fleet was drawn into a trap using fake civilian convoys that turned out to be empty hulls packed with pulse-triggered MP mines. Another encountered what appeared to be a broken satellite array until it activated and fired magnetic shard bursts like a shotgun into the enemy's hulls. The third ran into something they'd never seen before: hybrid vessels. These weren't Concordat designs. They weren't even purely human. They were Frankenstein monsters of engineering. Ships built from Concordat wreckage fused with human ingenuity. Alloy-plated husks powered by scavenged energy cores, with targeting systems that had been ripped from salvaged Concordat drones and rewritten by AI engineers in Bangalore. And they worked. Sloppily. Brutally. But effectively. The Concordat called it an aberration. Humanity called it progress. By the end of the second week, humanity had developed entirely new categories of combat. We had atmospheric fighters that used sound resonance to shatter shield harmonics. We had space mines that acted more like viruses, embedding themselves in enemy ship hulls and scrambling their targeting software. We had drop pods launched from orbital railguns that turned soldiers into high-velocity meteors, arriving on the battlefield before their own radio signals could. And every single one of these inventions came from someone breaking the rules. Not rules of war, rules of logic, of design, of physics. Where the Concordat saw limitations, we saw opportunities. Where they said, "That can't be done," we said, "Let's try anyway." On day 16, a Concordat scout fleet entered what they thought was an empty asteroid field. They didn't make it out. Turns out, it wasn't empty. The rocks had been hollowed out. Packed with heat-dampening arrays, camouflage drones, and an asynchronized defense net powered by a modified lunar reactor. The whole thing had been designed, built, and deployed in 4 days by a coalition of former miners, architects, and one disgraced physics professor. They hadn't asked for permission. They didn't need to. They sent a message afterward. "Hope you enjoyed the demo." Phase 2's bigger. Even our failures taught us something. A coordinated assault on a Concordat sensor array failed after their AI outmaneuvered our ships. Within hours, our data scientists had broken down the encounter frame by frame, fed it into Ares, and rewrote the algorithm that powered our stealth ships. The next attempt succeeded with a 97% reduction in casualties. The Concordat adapted in decades. We adapted in days. They tested one tactic at a time. We tested hundreds at once. And they weren't ready for it. They weren't ready for a species that learned faster under pressure, that built better under duress, that saw failure not as defeat but as a step forward. Commander Blackthorne summarized it best during a transmission to the Joint Command Council. Their entire civilization is built on refinement. Ours is built on reinvention. We've spent thousands of years perfecting systems. We've spent thousands of years finding ways to break them and rebuild them better. He wasn't boasting. He was warning them. Because every hour we fought, we weren't just getting better. We were becoming something new. At a classified site beneath the Canadian Rockies, a team of neurologists, AI engineers, and military historians created the first integrated combat prediction model, a quantum-driven system that didn't just respond to enemy moves, but generated entirely new tactics on the fly. The first test simulated a Concordat fleet engagement. The human system invented a maneuver that violated standard thruster dynamics by repurposing recoil as momentum in a rotational vacuum. It worked. One scientist fainted. The others applauded. The name of the maneuver, the bounce back. Soon, it wasn't just our weapons evolving. It was us. Back at Earth HQ, Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez reviewed reports from a squadron that had captured and reverse-engineered a Concordat phase shield generator. "You realize we don't even fully understand how this tech works," she said to her team. One of her engineers shrugged. "Doesn't matter. We figured out how to make it do something better." And they had, instead, shielding ships. They used the tech to trap Concordat missiles in micro-phased bubbles, causing them to collapse harmlessly inside their own dimension. They called it playing catch. By day 20, the Concordat knew they weren't facing a predictable enemy. They were facing a learning organism. A civilization that didn't just absorb damage, it metabolized it. And the worst part, we were still accelerating, still learning, still building, still changing. In the end, what scared them most wasn't the firepower. It wasn't even our speed. It was the realization that we had no finish line, no final form. They had thought New Eden was the climax of their campaign. It was only the prologue to ours. They say war is chaos, that battles are won by precision, numbers, or firepower. But those rules don't apply when the battlefield is constantly changing and your enemy is rewriting the rulebook in real time. By the 4th week, the war had changed. It wasn't humanity fighting like the Concordat anymore. It was something else entirely. Something messier, stranger, and far more dangerous. The Concordat, in all their millennia of galactic dominance, had never seen anything like it. They had studied our weapons, reviewed our early tactics, dissected our fleet designs. They thought they understood us, but they had only seen what we were. They hadn't prepared for what we would become. The turning point wasn't one single battle or moment. It was a pattern, or rather, a complete lack of one. Every engagement became a puzzle the Concordat couldn't solve. Their fleets would enter a system expecting resistance in orbit and get hit from beneath the crust of a moon. Their supply lines would vanish without warning, cut not by military assault but by economic sabotage launched from encrypted stock exchanges where human operatives had crashed whole currencies in minutes. One engagement over Neptune's orbit turned into a disaster when Concordat ships followed a decoy fleet into a magnetic storm seeded with ionized particles. Their shields shorted out. Human ships emerged hybrids, fast and vicious, and didn't fire a single shot. Instead, they launched imp-webs and tethered the Concordat ships in orbit like bait. 12 hours later, a second wave of human forces warped in, salvaged the wrecks, and disappeared without leaving a trace. They weren't fighting like a government or a military. They were fighting like a species. The Concordat's internal reports started using new terminology. Unorthodox tactics, unclassified weapon behavior, civilian-military fusion incidents, non-regulation engagement parameters. But that was just bureaucratic speak for, we don't know what the hell they're doing. And it was getting worse by the day. At Site Echo on the edge of Saturn's upper rings, human engineers were testing something wild in an attempt to convert ring debris into a weaponized kinetic swarm. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't safe, but it worked. By manipulating low-level magnetic fields and redirecting radiation bursts from the planet's surface, they created a targeting system that allowed them to paint enemy ships and then trigger a storm of frozen rock and metallic dust at relativistic speeds. They called it God's shotgun. When deployed during a skirmish, the Concordat ships shielded against lasers, particle beams, and traditional projectiles were torn apart by a hail of ice and tungsten. They'd built shields to stop everything but frozen gravel moving at Mach 30. That's what made humanity so terrifying. We didn't ask, what's the right way to fight? We asked, what do we have? How can we make it hurt? Then came the hybrids. Human engineers stopped trying to copy Concordat tech. They started fusing it with ours. A battleship once built from reinforced titanium plates now carried a Concordat gravitic core at its heart, tethered and stabilized by steel cables and patchwork algorithms. Its weapons weren't Concordat, and they weren't Earth standard. They were something else. Railguns using phased plasma fields to shape their shot trajectory mid-flight. Drones controlled by rudimentary ThoughtLink headsets built from repurposed neural scanning equipment. Cloaking systems that weren't invisible, but confusing, creating quantum interference patterns that made them appear in multiple locations at once. The Concordat called them ghost ships. We called them test runs, because each hybrid wasn't the final product. It was an iteration. If it failed, we rebuilt it. If it worked, we built 10 more. The Concordat built for generations. We built overnight. One of the first real battles that showed what humanity had become happened at Relay Point Sigma 9. It was a major Concordat hub, heavily shielded, defended by 3 orbital rings and a garrison fleet. Under normal conditions, a full frontal assault would have been suicide, so we didn't attack it, we took it. The operation was codenamed Skinwalker. It began with a civilian mining vessel, the Mason's Hand, posing as a lost cargo hauler. Its transponder codes were Concordat Standard, purchased off a black market relay by a Chinese intelligence group. The ship limped toward the station, venting coolant and broadcasting panic. The Concordat let it dock. What they didn't know was that the entire interior had been replaced. The cargo holds were pressure-stabilized marine deployment capsules. Crew. Special forces from 5 nations, including Mars-born exo-adapted units that could operate without pressure suits for up to 30 minutes. When the station dropped its shields for docking, the Mason's Hand deployed 4 spider drones that clung to the outer shell, moved to power junctions, and cut the lights. By the time the first emergency beacon sounded, half the station had already been taken. The Concordat fleet moved to respond, but the outer orbital rings had already been hacked. Their weapons turned inward. Within 20 minutes, Sigma 9 was no longer a Concordat relay. It was a human forward base, captured without ever firing a ship-to-ship shot. When the report reached the Concordat's command council, there was disbelief. How did they do it? They're not capable of infiltration at that level. They lack the cultural discipline for deception. No, we just lacked the motive, until they gave us one. At a weapons testing facility on Io, Dr. Imani Daniels stood before a room of military officers, engineers, and AI liaisons. on the holodable in front of her. A rendering of a new ship model, rough and brutal in shape, built from salvaged Concordat hulls, but with a distinctly human edge. "This isn't about elegance," she said. "This is about evolution." The ship's systems were modular, every piece could be replaced or reprogrammed in the field. It could warp, cloak, displace, and fragment itself mid-combat. Its armor was made of layered kinetic foam and fusion-doped carbon nanotubes. It wasn't meant to last decades. It was meant to kill everything in front of it in 5 minutes. "War is not a waltz," she said. "It's a bar fight. And we're the ones who break the bottle and come back for more." The room applauded. That shit became the prototype for the Chimera-class raider. Meanwhile, in deep space, a team of ex-convicts running supply raids had discovered that Concordat shields could be overloaded not by sheer energy, but by confusion. Their ships deployed buzzbombs, cheap, dumb drones that emitted erratic energy signatures, mimicking the power curves of actual weapons but never firing. Concordat shield AI couldn't handle the spam. They short-circuited, rerouted power, and then when the real missiles came in, failed to respond in time. It wasn't high science. It was just knowing how to break something by annoying it enough. And that's how we learned. Not from glory, not from ancient wisdom, but from relentless trial and error. One captured Concordat officer during an interrogation said it best. "They don't wait for the perfect moment. They make moments. They push until the rules break, and then fight in the pieces." He wasn't wrong. By the time the Concordat adapted to one tactic, we had already invented 3 new ones. Our AI systems began reprogramming on the fly using frontline data to feed new battle plans directly into commander implants. One admiral called it real-time evolution. She wasn't kidding. The Concordat believed in perfect formations, balanced firepower, tactical symmetry. Humanity laughed at symmetry. We created what the analysts started calling adaptive chaos fleets that weren't designed to stay together, but to break apart and reform depending on the battle. Some formations looked like scatter patterns. Others looked like debris clouds, but every one of them had a purpose. Our fleet commanders began adopting names like the Swarm, the Unseen, and the Hivebreaker. Not for intimidation, but to reflect how alien we had become. We didn't just borrow from Concordat technology. We absorbed it. We reimagined it, we rewired it, we repurposed it. And every time we did, we created something the Concordat couldn't counter because it didn't make sense. Their rules said ships needed captains, so we gave control to autonomous battlegroup AIs. Their rules said weapons needed calibration, so we gave ours randomness. Their rules said strategies had to be proven. We made them up on the spot. And the final insult, we started using their own strategies against them, but backwards, inverted, twisted. The hammer and spine maneuver, a classic Concordat tactic involving frontal assault and flanking pressure, was hijacked by human commanders who reversed it. Instead of pressing with heavy firepower, they faked a push, collapsed backward, drew the Concordat forward, and then unleashed flanking drones from within asteroid shadows. They didn't know they'd lost until their engines were offline. It was like fighting a mirror, but the reflection had claws. By week 6, the Concordat's invasion plans were dust. Their playbook, once gospel, was now useless, and the human fleet, still growing, still adapting, still winning. Not through overwhelming force, but through madness turned into method. The Concordat had ruled the galaxy for nearly 177,000 years. It was the oldest continuous power structure ever formed by intelligent life, a coalition of thousands of species, each contributing its unique culture, technology, and doctrine to a shared empire built on control, structure, and absolute hierarchy. Its fleets spanned solar systems. Its diplomacy crushed wars before they began. Its scientific councils prided themselves on slow, sustainable evolution, and then they tried to crush Earth. That single act, not just a war crime, but an assumption, was the mistake that unraveled everything they built. Because in their minds, the broadcast over New Eden was supposed to be the beginning of a short campaign, a lesson taught, a rebellion stomped out before it could spread. Instead, it was the trigger that launched the fastest, most devastating counteroffensive the galaxy had ever seen. And now, with a third of their command fleet shattered, their outer colonies falling like dominoes, and their own weapon systems turned against them, the Concordat stood face to face with an enemy they hadn't prepared for. Not an empire, not a rebellion, but a force of nature. The cracks didn't begin on the battlefield, they started in the council chambers. At the Grand Hall of the Concordat High Council, floating in the plasma shell of the Antares system, representatives from 17,000 member species gathered in emergency session for the first time in 8 millennia. Even getting them all in one place was a logistical nightmare. Thousands of minds, bodies, and consciousness types squeezed into telepresence relays, translated speech patterns, and cross-species comlinks. But the urgency demanded it. The Supreme Chancellor, a being of translucent crystalline structure named Nox, stood at the center, flickering with visible stress. Her voice echoed, measured but strained. "How did it come to this?" she asked, more to herself than the chamber. "We had the numbers, the firepower, the experience." The response came from one of the Silicon Consciousness delegates, a collective of semi-sentient computing crystals who spoke in harmonic pulses. They adapted faster than projected. They do not follow the standard development curve. A hive mind emissary buzzed in next. They break cohesion, use chaos. Yet it binds them tighter. They think like predators, offered a Voidwalker delegate, its voice stretched thin by subdimensional filters. But fight like swarms. A contradiction. "No," Nick said quietly, "not a contradiction. An evolution." The chamber fell silent. Outside the council walls, the reports were getting worse. One by one, the strongholds of the Concordat were falling. Not through overwhelming force, but through precision strikes, information warfare, and brutal psychological manipulation. Human agents had learned to mimic Concordat encryption, had reprogrammed their drone protocols, and were now speaking directly into the networks once thought invulnerable. Entire garrisons found themselves outmaneuvered by ghosts. Supply routes collapsed, communications blacked out. And when new reinforcements arrived, they found the enemy had already moved on, taking their weapons, their ships, and even their ideas with them. Humanity wasn't just winning, they were consuming the Concordat. At a tactical headquarters deep in the asteroid belt, Commander Zara Knight looked over a holographic map of recent engagements. 27 systems down in the last cycle, her second-in-command reported. Of those, 15 are under our control. The rest, gone dark. No survivors. Zara crossed her arms. "And how many of those we took by force?" 5. The others surrendered, some even asked to join. Zara didn't respond. Immediately. That's when it started sinking in. They weren't just beating the Concordat's forces, they were collapsing their belief system. In orbit above Kilo Vastra, a core Concordat planet known for its industrial shipyards, local citizens took to the streets. Not in panic, but in protest. Against the Concordat. The footage went viral across interstellar news relays. Alien civilians, members of once loyal species, held up signs written in their own dialects and, more recently, in human standard. "We refuse to fight for tyrants. New Eden was a massacre, not a warning. We welcome the humans." That, more than anything, shocked the council. Because now, they weren't just losing soldiers, they were losing minds. Back at Earth HQ, in a subterranean command chamber beneath the Andes, Blackthorn stood with representatives from every major coalition nation. The projections were clear. Concordat resistance was collapsing faster than anticipated. Fleet commanders were abandoning posts. Colonies were declaring neutrality or switching sides. Even their AI systems were showing signs of disobedience, possibly corrupted by the very human viruses they had once dismissed as primitive malware. Blackthorn didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. "This isn't the end," he told them. "It's the middle. Now comes the hard part." "What's that?" one general asked. "Figuring out what to do with a broken galaxy." In the meantime, the tide didn't just turn, it flooded. The Concordat's 7th Fleet, once believed to be untouchable, was wiped out in a 3-day running engagement that left over 90% of its vessels disabled or hijacked. The humans didn't destroy the ships. They took them, refitted them, improved them, turned them around. And when those same ships returned to Concordat space, their new human captains broadcast a simple message. "You taught us your rules. Now we're teaching you ours." Back in the Grand Hall, panic turned into paralysis. The crystalline delegates dimmed their forms in mourning. The neural collectives fractured under stress. Even the biologics, those species that still thought in terms of instinct and fear, began calling for retreat. "We must surrender," one said aloud. "We must ask to surrender." But the Supreme Chancellor shook her head. "We are the Concordat. We cannot beg." "Then we will die," came the response. But Nex had already known that. Deep down, she'd known it since the day of the broadcast. She just hadn't said it until now. The official surrender came not in a ceremony or a treaty. It came in a whispered message delivered directly to a human ambassador. No pop, no fanfare. Just one sentence. We accept your terms. Please, stop. But the humans didn't stop, not exactly. Because what they wanted wasn't land, or resources, or conquest. They wanted change. And change didn't come from surrender. It came from rebuilding. In the 10 cycles that followed the fall of the Concordat, a new power structure emerged, not a replacement empire, but a cooperative built on fusion. The human concorded cooperative. Its central tenet: no species would develop in isolation again. No more technological monopolies. No more hidden knowledge. No more hierarchy by tradition. Knowledge would be shared. Science would be open. And progress would be measured not by how long you'd held power, but by how far you could help others go. In what had once been the central seat of Concordat authority, now a diplomatic hub for the new era, a familiar voice echoed. Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez, now head of the Cooperative Science Division, addressed the gathered assembly. We're not here to rule. We're here to collaborate. You've seen what we can do alone. Imagine what we can do together. Her words were met with silence at first. Then slow, cautious applause, followed by more. The cooperative didn't just welcome former enemies, it absorbed them. Scientists from hive colonies worked side by side with Martian engineers. Voidwalkers taught human pilots to bend space around their vessels. Silicon consciousness clusters helped Earth-based AI break their own processing limits willingly. The galaxy wasn't just rebuilding, it was accelerating, and with acceleration came fear. Many still whispered about what would happen if humanity turned again, if they lost control or patience or purpose. But those who worked with them closely saw something different. They saw that humanity didn't hunger for conquest, they hungered for understanding, for discovery, for connection. They had been forged in chaos, tempered in grief, and hardened by war, but what remained wasn't destruction, it was direction. Zara Knight stood one day at a spaceport watching hybrid ships half human, half Concordat launch into the void. The vessels bore names from both languages, painted in colors that once symbolized enemy lines. One of her officers asked, "Do you think we'll ever be at war again?" She didn't answer right away. Then finally, yes, somewhere, but not like before. Not like this. Because now, the rules had changed. The galaxy had changed. Humanity had changed it. And in the end, the most powerful message came not from a battlefield, but from a classroom. On a quiet moon orbiting a quiet star, a teacher, a former Concordat citizen, stood before a room full of younglings, each from different species, and wrote a single phrase on a digital board: adapt, combine, share. When one student asked where the phrase came from, the teacher smiled. From the humans. After they broke everything, they taught us how to build again. 10 standard cycles had passed since the broadcast. 10 cycles since the Concordat, in all its ancient arrogance, tried to teach humanity its place in the stars by burning New Eden to ash. 10 cycles since the galaxy changed forever. The ships that now drifted silently through space bore little resemblance to the sleek vessels of the old order. These were neither Concordat nor purely human. They were something new, alloyed in spirit, forged in war, designed not just to destroy but to learn. Every hull bore scars, inscriptions, and signatures of multiple species. The designs were asymmetrical, modular, unorthodox, but unmistakably effective. The ships didn't just look evolved, they were evolved, living proof of the lesson the galaxy had been forced to learn the hard way. And above the newly formed cooperative homeworld, a reconstructed orbital complex once used by the Concordat Elite 4 humans stood on a platform, watching the stars as hybrid ships launched into the void. Commander Blackthorn, Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez, War Chief Zara Knight, and the former Concordat overseer turned cultural liaison, Rial. The war was over, but the story wasn't. "It's quiet now," Rodriguez said, her arms folded over a new generation adaptive combat uniform, more utility jumpsuit than military armor. "Too quiet?" Knight asked, her voice still carrying the wary edge of a soldier who didn't believe in peace without a catch. Blackthorn didn't answer right away. His calm gaze watched a ship disappear into warp, its thrusters flashing with multicolored pulses from 6 different propulsion systems, none of which had existed a decade ago. "Now," he finally said, "this is the sound of the galaxy, listening." Rial, the once proud Concordat officer who had stood on a bridge celebrating the death of 12 million human colonists, nodded slowly. We never imagined it would end like this. That you would be the ones to lead us forward." Rodriguez smiled faintly. "Neither did we." Across the galaxy, the ripple effects continued. The cooperative was no empire. It had no thrones, no emperors, no formal military branches anymore. Instead, it had collaborative research centers, fusion design labs, and hybrid education networks connecting thousands of species. A former hive mind colony once isolated by cultural xenophobia now coordinated agricultural drones with Martian bioscientists. A newborn AI from Earth helped an aquatic race develop underwater resonance shields using old Concordat sonar tech. An energy-based intelligence called the Luminary began transmitting raw mathematical theorems to every known civilization, unlocked only through cooperation with others. No one species held the keys anymore. The locks had been broken. The galaxy wasn't just recovering, it was transforming. And yet, for all the optimism, there remained an unease beneath the surface, because with every leap forward came the memory of what triggered it all: the broadcast. Some argued that humanity should never have forgiven what the Concordat did to New Eden. Others believed vengeance had already been served in full, not with destruction, but with change. The kind that rewrote the future. Still, for many, including the humans themselves, the question lingered: was it worth it? In a sprawling auditorium on Alpha Centauri Prime, a memorial was held on the anniversary of the New Eden massacre. The room was silent as holograms of the lost colonists played in gentle loops across the high walls. Faces of men, women, children, scientists, builders, farmers. People who had gone to the stars with hope in their hearts, only to be erased in the name of order. No grand speeches, no flags, just remembrance. And then one voice rose. A child barely 12 walked to the podium. Her name was Ayla. She was born after the war, the daughter of 2 survivors. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she spoke. "My parents told me about New Eden, about what they saw, what they lost. I never met my big brother. He was on the colony when it happened. But they told me something else too." She looked around, meeting the eyes of every being, every species represented. "They told me that what happened next was what made us who we are now, that the galaxy is different because of what we didn't become." She paused, blinking back tears. "We didn't burn the galaxy down. We rebuilt it, together." Silence followed. Then, one by one, every being stood. No applause, just quiet respect. After the ceremony, Commander Blackthorn found himself staring at a small monument outside the auditorium. A simple stone obelisk bearing a single inscription in galactic standard: "We learned." Rial approached him, hands behind his back. "You could have destroyed us," Rial said softly. "You had every reason to." Blackthorn nodded. "We thought about it. Some wanted to. Hell, for a while, I wasn't sure we wouldn't." "But you didn't," Rial said. "No," Blackthorn said. "Because we realized something." "What's that?" Blackthorn turned to look him in the eye. "Revenge ends with fire. But justice. Justice builds a future." That idea of transformation instead of retaliation spread farther than any weapon ever could. It became the guiding principle of the new galaxy. It inspired new science academies, art, diplomacy. It allowed once fragmented species to look past borders and languages and physiology and recognize that survival wasn't about isolation or domination but adaptation. The same lesson humanity had lived for centuries on Earth. You see, we were born on a planet that tried to kill us at every turn: weather, disease, predators, famine. We fought each other more than we probably should have, but every war, every disaster, every misstep taught us something. We were never the strongest, never the fastest, not the smartest, not the most graceful, but we were the most resilient, the most adaptable. And the moment the Concordat tried to crush us, they triggered the very thing that made us unstoppable. They thought they were teaching us a lesson in obedience. Instead, they taught us how to teach. In the years that followed, humanity became more than survivors. We became teachers, not rulers, not kings, but bridges. We shared what we learned. We opened our doors. We rewrote the idea of what civilization meant, not as conquest, but as co-creation. We taught species who had never collaborated how to combine technologies, how to problem solve across cognitive boundaries, how to break their own self-imposed limits. We showed them not only what we could do, but what they could do with us, and we never stopped asking questions. What else can we build? What else can we learn? What comes next? And perhaps that is humanity's greatest strength, not vengeance, not firepower, but the relentless refusal to accept limits. We don't follow paths, we make them. It's strange now, looking back, to think it all started with a message. One arrogant broadcast meant to cow a species into submission, a few minutes of condescension, 12 million deaths. One moment of evil that awakened a force the galaxy had never known. But maybe that's how history always turns on the smallest hinges: a sentence, a scream, a refusal. In one of the cooperative's new educational hubs on the former Concordat homeworld, students of all species study galactic history. One exhibit plays the broadcast that started it all, not to glorify it, but to remember what came before and what came after. Below the screen is a quote, carved into the wall in stone from Earth's Appalachian Mountains. It reads, "You wanted to teach us our place in the galaxy. Instead, we taught you how to change it." Epilogue, a real-world reflection. When we step away from the stars back to Earth, our real Earth, we realize that this story isn't just science fiction. It's a parable, a lesson wrapped in fantasy. One that reminds us that the greatest strength of any people, any nation, any species is not its weapons but its ability to adapt, to grow, to rise when broken. In our world, we too have seen what happens when arrogance blinds leadership, when power forgets compassion, when difference is seen as threat. But like the humans in this story, we also have the capacity to turn grief into innovation, to turn injustice into unity, to take our scars and build bridges with them. In every generation, there is a new Eden someplace, some tragedy that threatens to break us. And in every generation there is a choice. Do we burn everything down in revenge? Or do we build something new in its place? The fictional humanity of this story chose to build, to teach, to lead by example. May we have the courage to do the same. Because in the end, the galaxy doesn't just need warriors. It needs learners. It needs teachers. It needs people who, when pushed to the edge, don't just push back, they transform. And in doing so, transform everything around them.